So lately I've been working on both a massive iceberg video along with an essay about the 3D Legend of Zelda games. The Zelda video came about due to some frustrations I was feeling towards the current direction of the Zelda franchise. I was originally going to just leave a long-winded rant at the beginning of the iceberg video, but those thoughts kind of ballooned into a much larger discussion regarding the classic 3D formula along with the indie scene, which meant it needed to be its own video. So now I'm working on a Zelda essay that's already 13 pages deep as of writing, and as part of my prep work for that video, I've been playing a lot of games lately. I even had to dig my childhood Wii out of a storage bin that I keep under my bed, and I had to go buy a new Wiimote sensor for it along with a third-party HDMI cable. I also had to get my hands on some games and movies that were relevant to this discussion. I'm going to be playing Beyond Good and Evil for the first time, along with Okami and Darksiders, and I also had to seek out a Blu-ray copy of Conan the Barbarian. But among all these, one of the games I've been sinking deep into is The Legend of Zelda: Twilight Princess. Truth be told, my experience with the Zelda franchise was basically non-existent during the Wii era. I've played both Ocarina of Time and The Wind Waker on numerous occasions, and I also got my hands on Majora's Mask while working last year on my Ben Drowned essay. But up until very recently, the only modern Zelda games I've played were Spirit Tracks, A Link Between Worlds, and Breath of the Wild. Part of why I've avoided playing the Wii Zelda titles is because of that Egoraptor video about Ocarina of Time, which is something I'm going to dig into in my essay. But aside from that, I was also just busy with other game franchises at the time, such as The Elder Scrolls, Fallout, and Dark Souls. It wasn't until I really began to fall back in love with the N64 Zelda games, which I've been playing lately on original hardware, that I found myself wanting to give the Wii games a shot. And surprisingly, I've been really enjoying my time playing them both. I'm especially shocked with how much I'm enjoying Skyward Sword. I like how the Switch version adapts the motion control combat to the right thumbstick. It's almost like I'm playing a third-person version of Kingdom Come Deliverance. On top of that, the dungeon design in both these games really scratches that classic Zelda itch, which is something that I haven't been getting from the open-air Zelda games. But while playing Twilight Princess in particular, there was a moment in this game that sort of rubbed me the wrong way. This bridge section threw me into a fit of frustration that I hadn't felt since I was a kid playing the pachinko minigame in Mario Sunshine. It's a pretty short moment in the game when everything goes smoothly. But that's the thing. I was playing Twilight Princess on the Wii. Trying to precisely swing at the boar rider with my Wiimote without getting knocked off the bridge repeatedly made me want to cave my fucking skull in. And while it's easily the most annoying section I ran into so far while playing Twilight Princess, seriously, the second time is a lot less stressful when you have the bow and arrow, it wasn't the only one. The Panzer Dragoon section where you ride the giant bird to Zora's domain was also egregious. First of all, the fight before this section was pretty annoying. My main issue is that it wasn't clear which Wolf Link attack I was supposed to be using, since the game up until this point was encouraging me to use the B button for most enemies. The A button attack was used a fair amount before then, but only on enemies close to the ground. That being said, I'm glad they forced me to learn it here, because otherwise it would have made the Twilight Bloat mini-boss an absolute headache. But once you do defeat the bird, you're then thrown into this on-rails section where you have to avoid colliding into shit. Now, I'm no stranger to games suddenly throwing minigames at you out of nowhere. I grew up playing Sonic Adventure, so this shit is second nature to me. The part that was throwing me off was that this was happening in a Zelda game. And as I continued to play, more moments like this just continued to crop up. Why is John Nintendo shoving an escort mission down my throat? I just want to play my Farm Boy Simulator in peace. It wasn't until I discussed this with a friend of mine that I remembered just how pervasive this shit used to be in video games during the 2000s. Obviously, there was a greater emphasis on storytelling after the transition to 3D. And nowadays, you have games like Marvel's Spider-Man or the modern God of War games that truly feel cinematic without compromising on gameplay. But what I'm talking about is this period where video games were deliberately trying to imitate movies. Whether that was through restrictive gameplay, button prompts, or an absurd amount of cutscenes, this shit used to be everywhere. So in this video, I want to take a trip down memory lane. We'll explore how these games tried to mimic films, figure out why the style was so popular at the time, determine whether or not there's anything inherently wrong with games imitating films, and discuss how this style evolved into the modern AAA over-the-shoulder experience that literally every Western game regurgitates down our throats nowadays. But before we begin, this video is sponsored by me personally. Please, I beg you, I'm only about 100 subs away from 5K. I really need the validation. I think a good place to start would be to explore the techniques that games used to achieve this film-like composition. By composition, I mean how a scene or set piece is framed visually. Obviously, you also have stuff like sweeping orchestral scores that can help make a game feel more cinematic. But in this video, I'm solely going to focus on how the game looks. There's a lot of tricks and mechanics that developers use to pull the viewer into a scene the way a filmmaker would, and they each achieve this by limiting what the player can do. The most common example of this that we're all familiar with is the cinematic cutscene. Everybody loves these. They provide a moment for the player to breathe, they're usually really beautiful to look at, they often convey a lot more emotion than normal gameplay, and usually you can just skip them if you don't want to sit through it. The most common example people use when discussing cutscenes is Metal Gear Solid. It's often joked about in the MGS community that Metal Gear games are movies with pockets of gameplay, and in the case of MGS2 and MGS4, it almost ceases to be a joke. However, the reason why Metal Gear is able to get away with such long and frequent cutscenes is because the game uses them as a form of reward. The game's stealth sections can be pretty intense on higher difficulties, so giving the player a moment to engage with the game's story allows for them to decompress and prepare for whatever the game is about to throw at them next. On top of this, the cinematography in most Metal Gear games are utterly fantastic, so even cutscene detractors tend to tolerate them. This style of cutscene stands in complete contrast to dialogue box cutscenes, which have existed since the Super Nintendo days. These usually occur in the form of voiceless, in-engine scenes where characters speak through text boxes while moving using their normal character models or sprites. Most RPGs tend to tell their stories through these types of cutscenes along with normal dialogue tree interactions, with the immediate example for me being games like Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy VI. They're both valid ways for telling a story in a video game, but cinematic cutscenes are often far more effective. It's because of this why AAA RPG games tend to utilize a mixture of both. However, depending on what game you're playing, having an overabundance of dialogue box cutscenes can get obnoxious since you usually can't skip over them. Another way that developers imitate films is through QuickTime events, or QTEs. These scenes often lock the player out of normal control of their character and force them to participate in button mashing or precise inputs while a scene is playing out. It's functionally the same thing as sitting through a cutscene, but you're forcing the player to stay engaged with whatever is going on instead of being able to skip through it. On the one hand, QTEs can further draw a player into whatever is going on, and Asura's Wrath is probably the best example of this. It has traditional hack and slash gameplay akin to games like Metal Gear Rising or God of War, but on top of that, it utilizes button prompts in normal gameplay in order to condition the player to be ready for more elaborate QuickTime event sequences. Not to mention that once the QTE begins, your eyes will be treated to some of the most badass anime shit you'll ever see while playing a video game. But this is hardly the norm. Most games drop the ball when it comes to QTEs because they're often used as either padding or a substitute for what would have been a more fleshed out mechanic. An immediate example that comes to mind are the QTEs from Treyarch's Spider-Man 3. Whenever these show up, I almost want to take out my disc and throw it at the nearest wall. It's moments like this why Spider-Man 3 is so fucking dog shit. The QTEs in this game only take away from the experience, and they make me wish I were playing a better game like Spider-Man 2 instead. Granted, the QTEs are one of many problems with this game, but they're certainly the most egregious. However, if you think QTEs are boring, you could always just take away control of the player's camera instead. Early 3D horror games are rather infamous for using fixed camera angles to achieve a feeling of cinematography. The Silent Hill games especially make great use of their cameras to funnel the player into a certain mindset when playing. An immediate example that comes to mind is the mirror room from Silent Hill 3. It's an overhead shot from the entrance of the room looking down at the mirror on the opposite end of the scene. Not only does it center the player character and her reflection in the shot, but the scene begins to feel almost suffocating as the space slowly rots away and the player's own reflection ceases to follow them. The drawback to fixed camera angles though is that they can be unpredictable during tense gameplay moments. Say you're being chased down an alleyway by a monster and you turn the corner. Suddenly, the camera is no longer behind you and is instead above you, and if the developers didn't account for this, you may suddenly find yourself running into a wall. This can be alleviated by programming the game to move the player character in their intended direction despite the camera change, which would mean that the player's movement on the joystick needs to be relative to the previous camera angle until they let go of the stick. But you can also achieve this by forcing the player to use tank controls, which involves having to unlearn how most other games are played. The first method is referred to as 2D analog in games like Silent Hill 2, and it's how I prefer to play horror games with fixed camera angles. That's not to say that tank controls are bad, but I personally just don't care for them. But let's say that none of those are really cutting it for you and you really want your player to feel like they're in a movie. If you're truly that insecure, you could always just throw the player into some bullshit cinematic set piece. This is basically the bridge section from Twilight Princess that I was yapping about earlier. Games like Uncharted, for example, are filled to the brim with moments like this. And they drive me up the fucking wall whenever they're done wrong, because they usually go against everything that the game has taught the player up until that point. Like, there's a reason why in games like Assassin's Creed, stuff like the horse carriage section are mind-numbingly easy. These cinematic set pieces aren't supposed to be challenging, because otherwise they're just going to piss you off. The worst example of this that comes to mind is probably the racing minigame from Sonic Adventure 2, where you play as either Tails or Rouge and have to tail the president's limousine. I nearly dropped this game the first time I played it as a kid. These levels come out of fucking nowhere during the midpoint of both the hero and dark story, and they also require a certain level of precision in order to clear them. This is like if Kojima shoehorned the skateboard minigame from Metal Gear Solid 2 into the fight with Fat Man. It just doesn't belong here. Now, to play devil's advocate, Sonic Adventure 1 also had a moment like this with the X-Tornado, but that level was really easy by comparison, and it was admittedly a pretty cool set piece. And that's the thing. For this sort of set piece to work in your game, whatever's going on has to offset however frustrating it is to play through. It's no different than the QTEs in Asura's Wrath. It has to be seamlessly incorporated into your game. Finally, out of all these different techniques, you have stuff like the Telltale games, Until Dawn, or Detroit Become Human.
What is this shit? What's going on? Why don't they like it? We spent $250 million on this!
These games are functionally just interactive movies with small amounts of player control. It's sort of an evolution of the classic point-and-click adventure genre, but with a much greater cinematic flair. It's also a style of presentation that I'm rather indifferent about, which I imagine sounds hypocritical considering I grew up playing linear games like Zelda and Metal Gear. The difference to me mostly comes down to the amount of control and player expression you're given. The main reason I play a Zelda game is because they scratch a certain part of my brain while I'm going through dungeons and solving puzzles. By comparison, these games are basically no different to me than Dragon's Lair. The reason I don't vibe with games like Until Dawn is because they feel like time wasters. Why wouldn't I just watch a movie or play a visual novel instead? The entire appeal of a video game is that there's a level of interactivity that just isn't possible with films or books. When I'm playing a horror game, for example, I'm usually either solving puzzles, running away from a monster, or trying desperately to escape some horrible place. These games just make me wish I were playing something with more interactivity, and I think trying to emulate films this closely can be to the game's own detriment for most gamers. Now, none of that is to shit on these types of games though. I do need to stress that this is just my opinion. I mean, hell, Detroit in particular has 85 different endings, and it does a great job of disguising the genre's limitations. They have a place within the games industry, and they cater to a unique demographic within the gaming community. But with visuals like these, I typically expect there to be compelling gameplay. Again, why shouldn't I just play LA Noire, The Observer, or Cyberpunk 2077 instead? Beyond its story, what does Detroit have that they don't? The only positive thing I can say is that these sorts of games are a lot more forthcoming than a developer shoving a bunch of cinematic set pieces into an otherwise normal action game. At least I know what I'm getting into when I'm playing a Telltale game or Detroit Become Human. And considering Asura's Wrath also falls into this category, the genre clearly has a lot of potential to be able to branch out and experiment with other gameplay mechanics. So hopefully we're familiar now with a lot of the common techniques that developers use to emulate films within video games, along with the pros and cons that come with them. But that begs the question, why was this style of game so popular? I mean, there's a reason why most gamers tend to admonish these techniques and call them lazy design. It's because they used to be fucking everywhere. So before we can look at how the style fell out of favor, we first need to understand why it was once the norm to begin with. A major factor is without a doubt the release of Metal Gear Solid along with arguably Final Fantasy VII and Ocarina of Time. I mean, prior to this, the only games that really felt cinematic were literal full-motion video games like Night Trap, Wing Commander, and Tech War. However, those games were full of a ton of limitations that greatly restricted how players could express themselves. On top of this, you also had densely written CRPGs which were able to go toe-to-toe with films and even novels in the writing department, but their presentation often left a lot to be desired. What made Metal Gear Solid, Final Fantasy VII, and Ocarina of Time so brilliant is that they were able to take the lessons learned from that era and present a captivating story while still being a satisfying action game. And from there, a lot of console games iterated on what worked from those three titles, while riffing off of ideas from other games and taking creative risks of their own. PC games would for the most part go down a different path due to the impact of games like Half-Life. But even those games started to become infected by console game design after a certain point, and this can usually be felt in the design of in-game menus. Another major factor, at least in my mind, has to be the rise in popularity of rated M games during the 2000s. After the release of Doom and Mortal Kombat, the video game industry was in an arms race to see how far they could push the envelope. The reason why there were so many developers acting this recklessly is because it gave the gaming industry a lot of free advertising, which meant there was a lot more money that could be made potentially. However, their reckless behavior was also catching the attention of the US government, and out of fear of being regulated by the state, the ESRB was voluntarily formed in order to self-regulate the industry. However, the introduction of age ratings sort of created this stigma towards lower rated games, where anything rated below T for teen was essentially just a game made for babies. Obviously this wasn't true, but it did mean that the games rated T and M were the ones mostly leading the charge during the 2000s, so any sort of design choices that they leaned into were far more influential by default. It's also worth noting that between the 80s and the 2000s, we were living through the era of the blockbuster. This was the period in Hollywood before cinematic universes, where a movie had to be captivating on its own merits in order to be successful. And during this time, the world was utterly enraptured by the possibilities of the film industry. Obviously, the 80s gave us the likes of Star Wars, Jurassic Park, Terminator, and what have you. But by the 90s, we were beginning to see the influence of Japanese culture in films. Granted, the US is known for ripping off everyone's culture, but their fixation on Japan during this era was far more noticeable. And I mean, this shouldn't even be that surprising. Nintendo is literally the reason why Americans were willing to take a risk on video games after the 1983 video game crash. Japan dug its roots into our culture a long time ago, but the ramifications of the symbiotic relationship wouldn't really become apparent until 1999, when the world was introduced to the Matrix.
Holy shit!
The Matrix trilogy is a series I want to dedicate an entire essay to someday. It's one of the most influential pieces of media that our civilization has ever produced, and the ideas these films grapple with have never been more important. However, the reason why The Matrix is relevant to this discussion is because it was the first movie during this period of gaming that completely warped all the pop culture around itself. The effects of this can be felt in games like The Twin Snakes and Max Payne, which deliberately tried to imitate the bullet time effects of these films. But more importantly, The Matrix created this snowball effect where all the film industry entered into an arms race of its own to find the next big thing. It can't be understated just how saturated the 2000s is with classic blockbuster films. Whether it was Spider-Man, Lord of the Rings, 300, or Fast and Furious, the 2000s spawned a ton of insanely popular franchises that are still widely beloved to this day. And for developers at the time, it gave them a lot of material to pull inspiration from. So, because you had these three monumental events occurring simultaneously during the end of the 90s going into the 2000s, it just makes sense why the games industry would start riffing off of popular movies at the time. It clearly spawned out of an unabashed love of the medium, and I can't really blame them. Movies during this period were fucking awesome. But all good things eventually come to an end. By about 2012, the style of game was really starting to wear out its welcome, and it wouldn't be long before the AAA games industry would begin to look for new ways of achieving cinematic gameplay. The reasons for this are kind of complicated, but to untangle this, we need to talk about a single game first. We need to talk about 2012's The Last of Us. If you're even somewhat familiar with the games industry, you already know what this game is, or at least the company it came from. It was the first game to seamlessly blend cinematic storytelling organically into its gameplay without feeling clunky, and it was so influential that it turned fucking God of War into an over-the-shoulder action game. It was basically the Ocarina of Time of its time, and it set a completely new standard that AAA action games had to meet going forward. Granted, The Last of Us isn't really the problem here. Many people will tell you that both this game and even the new God of War titles are excellent. The problem is that from 2014 onwards, a lot of AAA developers in the games industry stopped taking creative risks and instead began to copy each other's homework. It's because of this why we have a million different studios chasing trends instead of just trying out new things. And while we did have trend chasing to some extent in the 2000s, the difference is that the games industry today is a lot more creatively bankrupt than it was during the 2000s. Like, I can complain all I want about these stupid set pieces in Twilight Princess, but at least that game was still trying to stay true to itself for the most part. It's because of that why the Zelda franchise has always managed to remain rather unique. As for our discussion though, the reason why this is important is because it signaled the end of experimentation when it comes to scene composition. The Last of Us, along with Dark Souls if I'm being honest, marks this inflection point where we begin to see AAA games shift away from older techniques like QTEs and cinematic set pieces and begin to adopt more seamless techniques. AAA games nowadays tend to draw a lot more from titles like Half-Life, where a lot of the story is told diegetically through unbroken gameplay. On top of that, there's also heavy influence from games like Metroid Prime and Doom 3. A lot of games nowadays have replaced long-winded cutscenes with stuff like codec tapes, and you usually find them by exploring the game and progressing through the story. I also think that Far Cry 3 and Outlast of all things have done a lot to make first-person games feel more cinematic. A lot of the characters in first-person games are incredibly expressive nowadays compared to the 2000s, and you'll often see your character emote with their hands and move naturally during in-game cutscenes. But above all, the success of The Last of Us forced developers to try and standardize certain control schemes. Like, there's a reason why I was poking fun at God of War earlier. The camera in those games used to be a deliberate tool that the developers could use to convey certain ideas to the player, and it gave developers a way to show off the game's beautiful art direction without distracting from what the player was doing. But now, God of War just feels like The Last of Us, but with a big muscle man carrying a boomerang axe. It's not a bad control scheme, it definitely works in service of the game's storytelling, but it's certainly less unique or compelling than the previous God of War games.
Oh my god, you're not Kratos!
Shut your bitch ass up, mortal!
Overall, this constant risk-adverse behavior from AAA developers is contributing to the stagnation of gaming as an art form. It's no different than the oversaturation of cinematic universes that were shoved down our throats during the 2010s. It's just that you're far less cognizant of this when playing these games, because the games themselves are still really fun at the end of the day. Like, I have to reiterate that none of this is to diminish the quality of these games as entertainment, but from an artistic standpoint, they're all incredibly stale. Except Resident Evil. I mean, they're just kind of doing their own thing. Hell, a lot of these complaints in general can be ignored when talking about Capcom. They've stayed pretty true to themselves, all things considered. Not even Nintendo can really say that anymore. At the end of the day, I think we can all agree that we just want our games to be fun, or at the very least recreational. Whether or not they should feel like movies is kind of irrelevant, but I will admit that it's cool whenever a game can hold my attention the same way a film does. So all that being said, I don't think we have to completely abandon these design techniques. They just need to not be so fucking obnoxious whenever they show up. When you're developing a game, there's an amount of necessary friction that you have to be within to keep a player engaged. If you have too much or too little of it, they'll just go and play something else. That sweet spot can vary depending on the goals of your game. Shit like Pathologic and Fungar are way the fuck over here on the cortisol meter. But when it comes to getting annoyed with a game, that's generally dependent on the expectations the developer sets forth to the player. Going back to Twilight Princess, the reason those set pieces bug me is because it feels out of place in a Zelda game. I have no issue with the QTEs in games like God of War, and I happen to actually like the fixed camera angles of old horror games, but that's because I know what to expect from those games. When I'm playing a Zelda game though, I'm only expecting to get into sword fights, explore a large open world with secrets to uncover, and complete dungeons with unique items and puzzles. So while I'm able to tolerate this shit in Twilight Princess, it still bothers me because it goes against everything I know about the Zelda formula. When you're making a game, you have to be able to identify the expectations of your audience, and you have to use that knowledge along with your own judgment to determine what mechanics should or shouldn't go into your game. Otherwise, you'll have some armchair critic posting a 7-hour essay about how the race car moment from Sonic Adventure 2 ruined their childhood, and why Takashi Iizuka should be sealed away inside the prison realm for his crimes against the Sonic fandom. But yeah, all things considered, I do kind of miss this style of game, even though it can be kind of frustrating sometimes. It's probably just my nostalgia talking, but when done right, it can make a game feel a lot cooler than it actually is. But what do you guys think? Should either AAA games or the indie scene try to revisit these mechanics, or do you think they're way too easy to fuck up? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and I'll try to read and respond to them. Anyways, I'm gonna go back to playing games and working on my scripts now. Remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye-bye.
lot of people were thinking, what is this, a cheap
EVGN
knockoff or something? But it was actually pretty good. Who the fuck are you?